It was a Friday evening, and I had just gotten home from school. I was 13 years old and couldn't wait to go hunting. Hunting has always been something I loved, especially at the ranch in Alice, Texas. I had been going there since I was 4, and I have so many memories from the place. My grandpa, my dad, and I would head out together, and we would sometimes meet up with other folks like the ranch owner's family. We were all packed and ready to go. It was deer season, my favorite time of the year. Just the thrill of spotting a big deer right in front of you is an incredible feeling, and of course, shooting it. People often say it's wrong to hunt, but I disagree if you're hunting to eat. We arrived at the ranch at around 10 p.m., so it was pretty dark by then. The ranch is about 300 acres, and the campsite is an old little shack, probably the size of a normal bedroom. There's electricity, but it's not a big cabin like the ones where most hunters sleep. There are beds, but I remember one time when my dad found a large snake skin in one of them when I was younger. So, since then, we always sleep in a tent. The camp is surrounded by woods, with a small field up ahead, roughly the size of a football field. We use that field for dove hunting. We unloaded our gear and spent some time chatting around the campfire, telling jokes and such, when suddenly we heard a scream. It was the most unsettling sound I've ever heard. It sounded like a hybrid between a human and an animal. The scream came from not too far away, and all of us froze, exchanging looks. Every man there was visibly freaked out. The ranch owner was the first to speak up, asking, "What the hell was that?" He then instructed us, along with one of his family members, to check it out. He's a pretty old guy, in his 70s, which is why we volunteered to investigate. We took my grandpa's ATV and did a quick search around the perimeter, but we found nothing. I was still shaken, even scared to go out to the blind by myself. As any hunter knows, we have to wake up before dawn and get into the blind without being seen by the deer. I went to bed in the tent with my gun next to me. The alarm woke me up, and I got ready. I was nervous about being alone in the dark, even though it was only an hour or two before dawn. The scream from the night before still echoed in my head. My grandpa dropped me off at the blind on his ATV and left. My dad was already in his spot. My grandpa's not one to coddle. He expects you to figure things out on your own. So, he just left me in the dark, expecting me to make my way up to the blind myself. I started climbing the ladder, navigating by feel. Once I got into the blind, I settled in and waited for the sun to rise. After about 20 minutes, it was still too dark, but I noticed something in the middle of the trail. I couldn't see it clearly, so I decided it was the perfect time to use the night vision scope my uncle had given me. I was eager, expecting a big deer, but when I looked through the scope, what I saw still haunts me. I don't care if you believe me, but I was expecting a deer and instead, I saw a person walking towards the woods. It looked strange, distorted, but still had the shape of a human. I don't know how it saw me, but I watched it turn and face me. The night vision isn't perfect, so I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could tell it was staring directly at me. Then it let out the exact same blood-curdling scream as the night before, but this time it was louder. At that moment, I can't even begin to describe the fear I felt. The word fear doesn't do it justice. I somehow broke through the shock I was in, grabbed my .22 rifle, and started firing the whole clip into the path it was standing in. Still terrified, I switched to my larger rifle and fired all the rounds into the path as well. When I checked through the night vision again, it was gone. I started getting messages and calls from my dad, who had heard the same scream. He and my grandpa had heard it too. We still go there to hunt, but it hasn't been the same since. Now, when I hunt, I always go with my dad because I'm afraid that thing might come back. I don't know what it was, but I know it survived 25 rounds from a .22 and 4 rounds from a .243. When we went back to check, there was no sign of blood, no footprints, nothing. I know it was still dark when I fired those rounds, but I'm sure at least one of them hit whatever it was. I was 14 when this event occurred, It was my very first deer hunting season with my family. Specifically, it was just my father, my cousin, and me. To give you some context, my hunting blind was situated about 2 miles south of my father's stand, which was roughly 9 miles southwest of our base camp. We drove a four-wheeler partway to my father's stand, parking it about 100 yards away. From there, I had quite a distance to cover on foot to get to my own hunting spot. Living in northern Michigan, I'm used to how quickly it gets dark during the winter month. That day, it was around 4 p.m. when I started feeling the chill and decided to pack up for the day. I had a .243 rifle with a pink camouflage cover and a shoulder strap so I could carry it on my back. After zipping up the flaps of my blind, I gathered my trash and tossed it into a bucket I had brought along. As I was cleaning up, I heard the sound of leaves crunching nearby. My attention snapped toward the noise, thinking it might be a deer. I waited for about a minute but eventually dismissed it as probably just a bird or squirrel. Feeling a little let down, I closed up my blind and started heading toward my father's stand. As I took my first steps, I noticed a freshly cleared path through the leaves. The trail was wide, too wide for a small animal or even a deer. My mind immediately went to larger predators like a bear or a wolf. My anxiety spiked and I picked up my pace, aiming to reach my dad as quickly as possible. With each passing moment, the forest grew darker, and I realized I was still about a mile away. Suddenly, I froze in my tracks. I was stopped by a sound that sent a chill down my spine, a noise unlike anything I had ever heard. It was a guttural, blood-curdling howl, almost like the scream of a man and a bear combined. The sound came from behind me, about 150 yards back. My heart racing, I broke into a run. Carrying my gear, including about 20 pounds on my back, made it hard to move quickly, but fear pushed me forward. Roughly 25 seconds later, I heard it again. This time, it was closer and much louder. The forest was completely dark now, with only the moonlight offering any visibility. I stopped and turned around, shining my headlamp in the direction of the noise. What I saw chilled me to my core. About 50 yards away stood a tall, shadowy figure, its outline illuminated by the moonlight behind it. It was around 10 feet tall, with a lanky frame. I didn't waste a second. I turned and ran as fast as I could, fumbling to get my gun off my back while sprinting blindly through the woods. I had no idea where I was headed. I just kept running. Eventually, I stumbled onto a road I recognized. Rabbit Road, the one that connects our camp to the entrance of the hunting area. I stuck to the road, running with everything I had until I saw the faint outline of our cabin. Reaching the cabin steps, I turned around one last time. The figure was still there, standing farther back, but clearly visible. It was tall and spindly, with unnaturally long arms and legs. As I reached the cabin, my body gave out. Exhausted, I vomited right there on the steps and collapsed, unable to move for several minutes. The next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of my dad's four-wheeler pulling into the driveway. Overwhelmed with relief, I ran to him, crying and hugging him tightly. I quickly told him everything that had happened, explaining how I ran non-stop to escape. At first, he didn't believe me, but as we settled inside, he saw the sheer terror in my eyes and began to take me seriously. I didn't sleep that night, or for several weeks after. People have since tried to convince me it was probably a bear or just my imagination. But I know what I saw. Now that I'm older, I never hunt alone. I also carry a larger firearm, which gives me some comfort in case I ever face something like that again. Even as I write this, I can say with certainty, that was the most horrifying experience of my life. It was the fall of 1986, and I was 23 years old. I'd never really felt fear in the woods before. In fact, the wilderness always seemed like my safe haven, a place where I could unwind and escape the pressures of everyday life. I'd never encountered Bigfoot, a skinwalker, or any sort of mythical creature lurking in the wood. As a lineman for a small town in West Kentucky, I'd experienced plenty of strange things, but they were always work-related. Being in a small municipality, we often wore many different hats, and utility disconnects weren't fun, but they were part of the job. Despite all the oddities in town, the woods had always been peaceful. Back then, my main hobbies were hunting and fishing. It was easy to find good spots to hunt by simply stopping and asking the landowners for permission. Many were happy to let hunters thin out the deer population, as they were damaging crops like young soybeans. Kentucky is coal country, and after much strip mining in the 1950s, large areas of land became unsuitable for farming or building. As a result, much of it was left open for hunting. It was October 1986, and daylight saving time hadn't yet started, so the sun stayed out until about 7 p.m. I left work at 4 and rushed home to change into my camouflage. It was bow season, my favorite time of the year. I was heading to an area I held dear, one we'll call Ridge. It was a remote region filled with broken farmland and dense woods. After parking, I decided to leave my three-wheeler behind and walk the 3/4 of a mile to my hunting spot. I was using a summit climbing stand, so I had to carry both my stand and bow, along with a fanny pack that held my knife and flashlight. I had to walk around the edge of the cornfield, which hadn't been harvested yet, but I stayed within the lane created by the farmer's equipment. The field was long and rectangular, with the higher elevation at the upper end and a creek with knee-deep water cutting across the bottom. I reached the upper end of the field, where I planned to enter the woods, and had to crawl through a thick blackberry thicket. Eventually, I found a game trail that led me through and opened up into a hillside surrounded by large trees. I chose a tree for my stand and, after some effort, climbed up. I loved being out in nature, and deer hunting was just an excuse to spend time in the woods. As a lineman, I was comfortable with heights, so I climbed higher than most. That day, I ended up about 20 feet up before the canopy began blocking my view. By 5:30, I was settled into my stand with an arrow nock. I'd set up permanent stands in the past, but had arrived late that day to avoid spooking any nearby deer. I'd also placed reflective tape along the trail to make it easier to find my way out at night, but today, I was in a temporary climbing stand in an area I hadn't hunted before. I was about to descend when I heard something moving through the thicket. I waited, thinking it was a deer, but couldn't get a clear look at it. It was nearly 8 p.m. and close to a full moon, so I could see fairly well. From my high vantage point, I felt like I could still shoot up to 15 yards, but it was after shooting hours, so I started down. As I was descending, I heard a loud crashing sound, and a deer must have noticed me moving slowly down the tree. Once I reached the ground, I quickly secured my stand and bow, then turned on my flashlight. The woods looked different at night, and when I illuminated the area, it felt foreign. Normally, walking in mature woods with little undergrowth isn't too difficult, but I was walking into a thicket. I walked along the edge of the thicket, trying to find the trail I had come in on, but had no luck. It was nearly 9 p.m., and I was eager to leave, so I began pushing through the thick brush. I kept the moonlight on my right shoulder, and eventually, I emerged into the field about 25 yards from where I had entered. As I stood there, pulling thorns out of my hands and legs, thinking the adventure was over, I glanced around the field. In the pale moonlight, I saw something. When I had first entered, the field was empty, and I hadn't heard any equipment or ATVs. So, seeing something in the trail was a shock. It wasn't just any small thing. It was 6 feet wide and 6 feet tall, standing in the middle of the field trail, blocking my only way out. Without hesitation, I started walking toward it, hoping it was just a shadow. I grabbed an arrow from my quiver, but I realized my knife was in my three-wheeler. I walked quickly but kept my pace steady. I was 100 yards away, and it didn't move. Still, I kept walking, and by 200 yards, I was getting closer. I could see it was 2 people standing side by side, and this unsettled me even more. It was 9:15 p.m., and the temperature was around 40 degrees. Nobody should have been out there. I kept walking, now only 20 yards away. They still didn't move. When I was 10 yards from them, I spoke. "Kind of cold out here, isn't it?" No response. They just stood there, unmoving. I kept walking, glancing back occasionally. The further I went, the more I felt uneasy. As I crossed the creek and was within another 100 yards of my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I reached my truck, I hesitated, silently observing it for about 3 minutes before approaching. It seemed fine, so I got in and drove away, but the unease lingered. The next day at work, during lunch, I ran out to grab food and noticed all 4 of my truck's tires were low. After inspecting them, I discovered each one had 10 to 15 roofing nails in them. I had to put tubes in them just to get home. Someone had definitely sabotaged my tires while I was in the woods. Since then, every time I've hunted in that area, I've felt like someone is watching me. I stopped going alone and never parked off the main gravel road again. I still don't know who those 2 young people were, or who punctured my tires, but I can never shake the feeling that something strange is always lurking there. During hunting season, I try to make it up to Maine at least once a year. I usually rent an Airbnb for the trip instead of buying a place, since it doesn't make sense to own property for just one annual visit. Plus, I'm still learning and gaining experience in hunting. In the past, I used to go with my uncle, but his health has declined over the years, so he's no longer able to join me. Lately, I've been going solo. My last trip was in November 2022. I had booked a cozy cabin near a national park. After work on Friday, I packed up, hit the road, and arrived late at night. The drive along the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin was eerie, pitch black and deathly quiet. Without insects or crickets in the cold November air, the silence was unsettling. As the owner had instructed, I found the key under the doormat. After unloading my 2 bags and settling into the single-bedroom cabin, I was relieved to find the place warm and welcoming. The host had turned up the heat in advance. The cabin had Wi-Fi and cable, so I set an alarm for dawn and prepared for the early hunt. At first light, I was out in the woods, setting up behind some fallen trees I stumbled upon. As I prepared for the long wait, a man's voice startled me from behind. Whipping around, I saw a gray-haired man, likely in his 50s, approaching with a stern expression. "What are you doing here?" he barked. Confused, I explained I was hunting. He told me hunting was prohibited in that area. When I apologized, explaining I wasn't aware of the rules, his reply was chilling. "I saw you drive up. People like you always come here for the wrong reasons." His words unnerved me, especially the part about watching me arrive. I grabbed my gear and left, heading back to the cabin to regroup before driving to another park listed online as hunting approved. The first half of the day proved unsuccessful, so I returned to the cabin for a meal. Oddly, the door was unlocked when I arrived. I could have sworn I locked it, but I brushed it off as a mistake. Still, something felt off. Items seemed slightly out of place, and my bag, which I typically keep zipped, was open. After a quick check of the cabin, I decided to grab takeout from a nearby village. With Chinese food in hand, I returned, ate quickly, and took a nap. Later, I headed back out to the park, but luck wasn't on my side. As night fell, I returned to the cabin, cooked dinner, and unwound with an old black-and-white movie on TV. The earlier unease crept back into my mind. Was the unlocked door a fluke, or had someone actually been inside? Brushing it off, I moved to the bedroom, planning to fall asleep to another movie. As I began to drift off, a distinct clicking sound jolted me awake. The closet door, previously shut, was now slightly ajar. Adrenaline surged as I grabbed my CZ-75 from my hunting pack. Turning on the bedroom light, I aimed at the closet, shouting, "Come out, or I'll shoot." To my shock, the older man from earlier stepped out, his stern face replaced with a toothless grin. "You got me," he sneered. I kept my gun trained on him and grabbed my phone to call 911. With service thankfully available, I explained the situation and waited for deputies to arrive, all while keeping the man at gunpoint. During the agonizing wait, he rambled about being tired of visitors disrespecting the parks. I ignored him, repeatedly telling him to shut up. When the sheriff's deputies finally arrived, they arrested him for breaking and entering. Although nothing appeared to be stolen, the man claimed the door had been left unlocked. The Airbnb host backed this up, insisting there were no spare keys. He seemed more concerned about his property than my ordeal. I still don't believe I left the door unlocked. Thankfully, I had my firearm and could protect myself. This trip will definitely stay with me for a long time. If these stories gave you the chills, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another spine-tingling tale. What did you think of these stories? Were they creepy? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. And always remember, the wilderness isn't always what it seems. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.